In the heart of a volcanic peninsula, where the earth itself seemed to breathe fire and the sky was perpetually stained with ash, there once stood a civilization so magnificent that even millennia later, its memory would inspire both wonder and terror in equal measure. This was Valyria, the greatest empire the world had ever known, a place where dragons darkened the heavens like living storms, where towers pierced clouds heavy with volcanic smoke, and where magic was woven into the very fabric of daily existence as naturally as breathing. For 5,000 years, this impossible civilization flourished, growing from humble beginnings among shepherds into a power that reshaped the known world, only to vanish in a single cataclysmic day of fire and fury that would become legendary as the Doom. Tonight, we trace the complete arc of this extraordinary civilization from its obscure origins to its apocalyptic end, seeking not just to chronicle what happened, but to understand what lessons this ancient empire might carry for us across the centuries, whispers of wisdom from the ashes of glory. Long before dragons darkened the skies of Essos or Valyrian steel gleamed in the hands of lords and kings, there existed a people who knew nothing of conquest or power, who had no aspirations beyond survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. They were shepherds, simple folk who guided their flocks across the volcanic peninsula that jutted southward into the summer sea, a landscape that seemed deliberately designed by nature to test the resilience of those who dared call it home. The land they inhabited was dominated by a ring of 14 active volcanoes that the locals called the 14 Flames, mountains that were perpetually active, belching smoke into the sky, and occasionally sending rivers of molten stone cascading down their slopes. These were not gentle sleeping giants, but rather perpetually simmering behemoths that reminded those who lived in their shadow of the precariousness of existence. The shepherds had learned over generations to coexist with these fiery mountains, finding that the volcanic soil, while dangerous, was rich enough to support grazing lands, and accepting the ever-present danger as simply part of life in this remote corner of the world. They built their humble settlements in the valleys between the mountains, where the ash from eruptions enriched the soil and made the grass grow thick and green, perfect for their flocks. They developed customs and traditions around the volcanoes, treating them with the reverence that ancient peoples often reserved for forces beyond their understanding, offering sacrifices and prayers to appease what they perceived as the angry gods dwelling beneath the earth.
These early Valyrians left behind few records of their origins. No grand chronicles written on parchment or stone, no carefully preserved histories that would tell later generations who they were and where they came from. What we know of them comes from fragments mentioned in later texts, stories passed down through countless generations until they took on the quality of myth and legend, transformed by the telling into something almost unrecognizable from what might have actually occurred. They were, by all accounts, an unremarkable people in an age when empires rose and fell across Essos, when great powers contended for dominance, and civilization seemed to be advancing rapidly toward new heights. To the east of their volcanic peninsula lay the old empire of Gis, an ancient power that had already conquered vast territories and built its dominance on the backs of slave legions and the organizational genius of its ruling class. The Ghiscari, with their bronze legions and their ancient cities, would have looked upon these shepherds, if they looked at all, with nothing but contempt and perhaps a touch of amusement. What threat could a handful of goat herders pose to an empire that had stood for centuries, that had weathered countless wars and emerged stronger each time? The Ghiscari considered themselves the masters of the known world, the inheritors of a civilization that had reached heights of cultural and military achievement that no other people could match. They would have seen the Valyrians as beneath notice, as irrelevant as the goats they tended, destined to remain forever obscure while their betters shaped the course of history. But the shepherds possessed something that the Ghiscari did not, something that would ultimately prove more valuable than all the legions and all the organizational genius of the old empire. Within the 14 flames, in the deepest volcanic chambers, where heat reached unimaginable intensity and toxic fumes could kill an unprotected man in seconds, something ancient and magnificent dwelled. Perhaps these creatures had always been there, slumbering in the heart of the mountains, waiting for the right moment to emerge into the world. Perhaps they had been drawn to the volcanoes from some distant place, seeking the heat and the darkness and the isolated sanctity of the flames that were their natural environment. The legends don't say with certainty how the first shepherd discovered them, how a simple herder tending his flock in the shadow of an active volcano found himself face to face with creatures that would change the destiny of his people forever. But discover them he did, and that discovery would set in motion events that would reshape the entire world. Dragons, not as metaphor or artistic representation, not as symbols of power in the heraldry of later houses, but as living, breathing reality. Creatures with wings that could blot out the sun, with scales harder than any armor yet forged by human hands, with fire in their bellies hot enough to melt stone into flowing glass and reduce armies to ash in moments. These were the dragons, the creatures that would make the Valyrians masters of the world and ultimately contribute to their undoing. Imagine the terror of that first encounter, the shepherd, perhaps, seeking a lost animal or exploring a cave where wisdom said not to go, descending into caverns lit by the red glow of distant magma, the air shimmering with heat so intense that it was difficult to breathe. And there, in a chamber carved by nature, or perhaps by the creatures themselves over countless centuries, he would have found dragons. Not one, but many, ranging from newly hatched things no larger than dogs to ancient beasts whose very presence would have made the mountain itself seem small, whose eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and alien and utterly indifferent to the fate of a lone human shepherd. The rational response would have been to flee, to run back to the safety of the surface world and never speak of what had been seen, to pretend that the encounter had never occurred and that such things could not possibly exist. But something different occurred instead, something that speaks to the character of these early Valyrians and their willingness to embrace the terrifying unknown. Whether through courage or madness, whether driven by some deep-seated curiosity that overcame their survival instincts, or perhaps because the dragons themselves somehow communicated with them, making them understand that this encounter was fated, the shepherds did not run. They stayed, watching the magnificent creatures, observing their movements, learning their patterns, and slowly, over years and decades, they began to understand them in ways that no other people ever had or ever would.
The taming of dragons was not a simple process that could be accomplished through brute force or sheer determination. And it would be a grave mistake to imagine it as merely a matter of whips and chains, or the kind of dominance training used on horses or dogs. Dragons are not beasts to be broken or trained through simple reward and punishment. They possess intelligence that rivals or perhaps exceeds that of humans, and they will not bend to force alone, for their pride and their power make them resistant to any form of coercion. The early Valyrians must have discovered this truth through bitter experience, through failed attempts that surely cost lives and perhaps entire settlements, through watching friends and family members burned to ash or torn apart by creatures that they had thought they could control. But they persisted, and in that persistence they made discoveries that would change the course of history and elevate them from obscure shepherds to masters of the known world. Magic entered the equation, whether learned from travelers from distant Asshai, where sorcery had ancient roots, or developed through their own experimentation driven by desperation. The Valyrians discovered that dragons responded to blood and fire. Not merely the physical fire of torches and hearths, but something deeper, something that resonated with the fire that burned in the dragons themselves and connected rider to mount in ways that transcended mere training. They developed rituals, spells whose specific nature has been lost to time, but whose effects were undeniable and transformative, forging bonds that could not be broken by any force known to mortals. Through these means, they forged lasting bonds with the dragons, connections that went beyond master and beast into something more fundamental and spiritual, something that would define their civilization for 5,000 years. A dragon would choose its rider, accepting them in a way that seemed almost spiritual, as if the creature could look into the soul of a human and recognize something that made them worthy of the incredible power that came with riding a dragon. And once that bond was formed, it held for life, so that when one died, the other would often follow shortly after, unable to bear the loss of the connection that had defined their existence. The transformation this wrought upon the Valyrian people was not merely political or military, but physical, and perhaps even metaphysical. Whether through long exposure to the dragons and their magical influence, through the blood magic they practiced to forge their bonds, or through some combination of factors that even they might not have fully understood, the Valyrians began to change in ways that set them apart from all other peoples. Their eyes, once brown or black or green like those of any other human population, shifted to purple and violet, colors that seemed to echo the flames they worked with and the sorcery they practiced. Their hair lightened to silver and platinum white, giving them an appearance that was almost otherworldly, that seemed to mark them as touched by something beyond the ordinary concerns of humanity. With dragons at their command, the shepherds were shepherds no more, for the creatures that they had discovered in the volcanic depths had transformed them into something far greater and far more terrible. They began to build, not mere villages or towns to shelter their flocks and families, but a city worthy of their newfound status and power, a capital that would reflect their mastery over the forces of nature and magic. The city of Valyria arose in the shadow of the 14 flames, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before or would see again, a testament to the limitless ambition of a people who had discovered that the only limits that existed were those they chose to accept. The Valyrians had discovered that their magic could be applied not just to living creatures, but to the very stone itself, that they could shape the physical world with their will as if potters shape clay. They did not cut and chisel their buildings as other peoples did, laboring for years to raise a single structure, but worked stone as if it were soft and malleable, shaping it through fire and sorcery into forms that seemed to defy the laws of nature and the limits of architecture. Towers rose without visible support, soaring so high that their peaks were lost in the clouds and the volcanic ash that perpetually hung over the city. Bridges spanned distances that should have required massive pillars and supports, but instead floated on nothing but air and magic, held aloft by spells that had been woven into their very structure. The city was a testament to the marriage of power and artistry, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a place where the impossible became routine, and the wonders of one generation became the foundations for the wonders of the next. The establishment of Valyria as a city marked the true beginning of what would become the Valyrian Freehold, the point at which the shepherds fully transformed into dragon lords and set their sights on the wider world. They organized themselves not as a kingdom with a single ruler whose word was law, but as a freehold, a confederation where all who owned land had a voice in governance, where the decisions that would shape their civilization were made collectively rather than imposed from above. This was on its surface a surprisingly democratic arrangement for an ancient civilization, a recognition that even the most powerful individuals could benefit from the wisdom of the group and the checks that collective decision-making could provide. But as with many such systems, the reality proved less egalitarian than the theory, for power gravitates naturally to those who possess the means to enforce their will. And in Valyria, those means were dragons. While technically any landholder could participate in the governance of the freehold, the reality was that those who commanded dragons held the true power, their voices carrying weight that others could never match. The dragon lords, those families who had mastered the art of dragon riding and who maintained their own flights of the great beasts, formed an effective ruling class that controlled the destiny of the freehold. Approximately 40 families came to dominate Valyrian society, the great houses of dragon lords whose word carried weight and whose dragons made that word law, a ruling elite that governed with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of shared governance. These were not kings in the traditional sense, not rulers whose authority was absolute and unquestioned, but they might as well have been, for their dragons gave them power that no king could match and that no rebellion could challenge. Among these 40 families were houses whose names history has forgotten, lost in the destruction that would eventually claim them all, their achievements and their failures erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Among them, too, were the Targaryens, who would survive when all others fell and carry the legacy of Valyria into a new age, though at this early stage they were far from the most powerful or influential of the Dragon Lord families. They were respectable, yes, possessed of ancient lineage and their own dragons, but in the great game of Valyrian politics they were players of middling importance at best. Important enough to be consulted on major decisions, but not powerful enough to shape those decisions on their own. The transformation from shepherds to dragon lords had taken centuries, perhaps longer, a gradual evolution rather than a sudden revolution, each generation building upon the discoveries of the last, each adding to the body of knowledge about dragons and magic and power that would make their descendants the greatest civilization the world had ever known. By the time Valyria emerged as a force that would reshape Essos and challenge the ancient powers that had dominated for millennia, the origins as simple herders must have seemed like a distant dream, barely remembered and possibly embellished beyond recognition, a convenient origin myth that obscured the true nature of their rise to power. But those origins mattered, for they established a pattern that would define Valyria throughout its existence: the relentless pursuit of power through the mastery of forces that others feared to touch, the willingness to push boundaries that others considered unthinkable in the pursuit of knowledge and dominance. The shepherds had dared to enter the 14 Flames and claim what they found there. Their descendants would dare far more, reaching ever deeper into the realms of magic and ambition until they reached too far and fell. The Valyrian Freehold, once it had coalesced from a collection of dragonlord families into a coherent political entity, represented something genuinely new in the world, a form of governance that challenged traditional notions of power and authority. It was not an empire in the traditional sense, with a central emperor whose word was absolute and whose succession determined the fate of nations, but rather a confederation of equals, at least in theory, where all who held land freely possessed the right to participate in governance and to have their voices heard in the great decisions that would shape their civilization's future. This was the meaning of Freehold, a society where the free-born landholders controlled their own destiny, rather than submitting to the will of a distant monarch. But theory and practice, as they so often do in human affairs, diverged sharply in ways that would have been obvious to any observer who looked beyond the surface. While technically any landholder could participate in governance and have their voice heard, the reality was that those who commanded dragons held the true power, their voices carrying weight that others could never match. The dragon lords, those families who had mastered the art of dragon riding and who maintained their own flights of the great beasts, formed an effective ruling class that controlled the destiny of the Freehold. Approximately 40 families came to dominate Valyrian society, the great houses of dragon lords, whose word carried weight and whose dragons made that word law, a ruling elite that governed with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of shared governance. These were not kings in the traditional sense, not rulers whose authority was absolute and unquestioned, but they might as well have been, for their dragons gave them power that no king could match and that no rebellion could challenge.
Among the dragon lords themselves, a hierarchy existed based on the number and size of their dragons, the antiquity of their lineage, and the mastery of the sorcerous arts that were integral to Valyrian power. At times when circumstances demanded unified leadership, when the Freehold faced existential threats or opportunities that required coordinated action, the Lord's freeholders would elect archons to serve as temporary supreme leaders. These were not permanent positions, not dynasties that could become entrenched and challenge the collective rule of the dragon lords, but rather emergency measures deployed when the situation demanded decisive action that the slow processes of collective governance could not provide. The archons would serve their purpose and then step down, returning power to the collective of dragon lords who had elevated them, a system that managed somehow to balance the competing ambitions of dozens of powerful families while still allowing the Freehold to act decisively when needed. This system of governance, for all its flaws and inequities, proved remarkably effective for 5,000 years, allowing the Valyrians to maintain their dominance over the known world while avoiding the civil wars and succession crises that had brought down so many other empires. It was not perfect, far from it, but it worked well enough to sustain the greatest civilization the world had ever known, a civilization whose achievements would inspire wonder and terror for millennia after its fall. The heart of Valyrian power, beyond even the dragons themselves and the political system that governed their use, lay in their mastery of magic, which they had elevated from scattered practices and folk traditions into a systematic science that permeated every aspect of their civilization. The Valyrians were not merely talented sorcerers or practitioners of the dark arts. They had made magic into a discipline as rigorous as any other field of study, with its own principles and methods that could be taught and learned like any other subject. All Valyrian magic, according to the scholar Marwyn, who studied these matters centuries after Valyria's fall, was rooted in blood or fire, two primal forces that had been central to human experience since before the dawn of civilization. These were not mere poetic metaphors for the nature of their sorcery, but literal truths about how their magic functioned and what it required. Blood magic, the darkest and most potent form of magical practice, required the sacrifice of living things to fuel its workings. The life force of the sacrificed being channeled into the spell to achieve effects that would otherwise be impossible. The greater the sacrifice, the more powerful the magic that could be achieved, which is why the Valyrians were willing to sacrifice hundreds or thousands of slaves in their most powerful rituals. Fire magic drew upon the primal force of flame, particularly the unique fires that burned in dragons and in the volcanic depths of the 14 flames, channeling the heat and energy of these sources to achieve effects that ordinary fire could never produce. The blood mages of Valyria, known as blood mages or mappermances, practiced arts that would have been condemned as abominations in most other cultures, pushing the boundaries of what was natural and what was perverse in their relentless pursuit of knowledge and power. In the flesh pits of Gogossos, a Valyrian colony on the Isle of Tears in the far south, blood mages engaged in acts of such grotesque cruelty that even the limited records that survive speak with them with horror and revulsion. They would force slave women to mate with beasts, using their magic to ensure that pregnancy resulted from these unions and that the offspring survived to serve their purposes. The offspring, twisted half-human creatures called chimeras, served various purposes in Valyrian society. Some kept as curiosities in the palaces of the dragon lords, others used as slaves for particularly dangerous or demeaning tasks that ordinary slaves could not perform. Still others served as subjects for further magical experimentation, their hybrid nature providing insights into the nature of life and magic that could not be gained through other means. These practices extended beyond the creation of chimeras, with some scholars, including the renowned Septon Barth, speculating that the Valyrians had used their blood magic to create the dragons themselves, perhaps breeding them from wyverns and other lesser reptiles through sorcerous manipulation over countless generations. What is certain is that the relationship between Valyrians and their dragons involved magic at a fundamental level that went beyond simple training or domestication. The bond between rider and dragon, forged through rituals that likely involved blood sacrifice and perhaps death. The most visible and enduring legacy of Valyrian magical prowess was their steel, which became legendary and remained so centuries after the Freehold's destruction for good reason. Blades forged from this material possess qualities that seem to defy natural law, lighter than castle-forged steel, yet harder and stronger, capable of holding an edge that never dulls, remaining sharp as the day they were forged, even after centuries of use and neglect. The metal itself is distinctive, featuring rippled patterns that flow across the surface like water frozen in metal, darker than normal steel and often appearing almost black in certain lights.
The creation of Valyrian steel involved both mundane and magical techniques. The steel folded thousands upon thousands of times to remove impurities and create the distinctive patterns that are visible in finished blades. But folding alone could not account for the steel's supernatural properties, which required spells that were incantations passed down through generations of master smiths, likely requiring blood sacrifice to power them and dragon fire to achieve the intense heat necessary for the forging process. The specific details of the process were closely guarded secrets, even within Valyria, known only to the master smiths who devoted their lives to the craft and who passed their knowledge down through apprenticeships that could last decades. When Valyria fell and the doom claimed the lives of everyone who possessed this knowledge, the secret of creating new Valyrian steel died with them, leaving only the existing blades as evidence of what had been achieved. Only one place in all the world retained even partial knowledge of the art, the free city of Quohor, whose smiths could rework existing Valyrian steel, melting down swords to create new ones, or repairing damaged blades. But even they could not create entirely new steel from raw materials, lacking the spells and techniques that had made the original creation possible. The creation of Valyrian steel represented just one application of their magical knowledge, one facet of a civilization that had made magic into a science, and science into magic. They possessed glass candles, objects made from obsidian that burned with a strange light and served as tools of immense power, allowing a skilled sorcerer to see across mountains and oceans, to peer into the dreams of men hundreds of miles away, to speak mind to mind with others who possessed similar candles. With these candles, the Valyrians could gather intelligence from across their vast domains, coordinate military campaigns over impossible distances, and maintain the cohesion of their far-flung empire in ways that would have been impossible through mundane means alone. The capital city of Valyria reflected this magical mastery in every aspect of its construction, a physical embodiment of the power and ambition that had created the greatest civilization the world had ever known. According to King Viserys, the first Targaryen, who became obsessed with Valyrian history and spent years building a scale model of the city based on historical records, Old Valyria was built partially inside an active volcano, with the highest nobles living in structures carved into or built against the volcanic face itself. These palaces were presumably protected by magical wards that allowed their inhabitants to live in comfort mere yards from molten rock, taking advantage of the heat and energy of the volcano while remaining safe from its dangers. At the heart of the city stood a building called the Anagrian, where the blood mages practiced their arts and conducted their most terrible experiments, a place of immense power and tremendous horror that was the center of Valyrian sorcery. The topless towers of Valyria, mentioned in songs and histories with a mixture of wonder and melancholy, were just one of the architectural marvels that defined the city, rising to heights that seemed to defy structural possibility, their peaks lost in clouds and smoke from the surrounding volcanoes. These towers required no visible buttresses or supports, standing through some combination of sophisticated engineering and magical reinforcement that has never been replicated. Sphinxes, not the traditional lion-bodied creatures of mythology, but rather dragon-bodied beings with human faces, served as decorative elements throughout the city, possibly serving some magical purpose as wards or guardians imbued with protective spells. The dragon roads that connected Valyria to other cities within the Freehold were not simple dirt paths, but sophisticated constructions, many carved directly from volcanic rock, or paved with stones fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed. These roads allowed for rapid movement of troops, goods, and information throughout the Freehold's territories, another demonstration of the Valyrian philosophy that everything should be a reflection of power and permanence.
The government structure, despite its theoretically democratic foundations, evolved into something closer to an oligarchy, where the Dragonlord families competed constantly for influence and resources, their rivalries and alliances shaping the destiny of the Freehold. There were approximately 40 major Dragonlord houses, each with their own dragons, their own magical secrets, their own ambitions, and their own vision for the future of their civilization. These families formed and broke alliances, married across houses to combine bloodlines and dragons, engaged in feuds that sometimes lasted generations, and schemed constantly to increase their power and prestige at the expense of their rivals. It was a game of thrones long before that phrase would be applied to Westeros, with the same stakes and similar brutality, though with the added dimension of dragons and magic that made the stakes even higher. The difference was that in Valyria, the game was played with weapons that could burn cities and powers that could twist flesh and stone, making even the most mundane political dispute potentially catastrophic in its consequences. The Targaryens occupied a middling position in this hierarchy, an old and respectable family with their own flight of dragons, but far from the most powerful or influential houses. In the councils of the Dragonlords, Targaryen voices were heard, but not necessarily heeded, their dragons formidable, but not the largest or most numerous, their lands adequate, but not vast. They were, in short, survivors rather than conquerors, a family that understood how to persist through the ages without attracting the dangerous attention of more powerful rivals, a quality that would ultimately save them when all other Dragonlord families perished. The culture that developed in the Freehold was complex and contradictory, reflecting the tensions inherent in a civilization built on power and ambition. They valued freedom for themselves while keeping countless others in chains, believing in their own liberty while denying it to everyone else. They created beauty while committing atrocities, building wonders that inspired awe while enslaving millions to make that construction possible. They pushed the boundaries of knowledge while refusing to recognize moral boundaries, treating the pursuit of power as an end in itself that justified any means. The Valyrians practiced customs that other cultures found shocking or disgusting, maintaining traditions that set them apart from all other peoples. They permitted polygamy, with Dragonlords often taking multiple wives to strengthen their political alliances and produce more heirs. More controversially, they practiced incest, frequently marrying brother to sister or other close relatives to keep their bloodlines pure and their magical abilities strong. This practice stemmed partly from their belief that their blood, the blood that allowed them to bond with dragons, needed to be kept pure, that any dilution through marriage to lesser folk would risk losing the abilities that made them special. It also served political purposes, keeping power concentrated within the great families and preventing outsiders from gaining influence through marriage alliances. The Valyrians also practiced slavery on a scale that staggers the imagination, turning the conquered peoples of their wars into chattel to be used and discarded as they saw fit.
The mines beneath the 14 flames were worked by slaves who died by the thousands, their bodies fueling the wealth and power of their masters. The flesh pits of Gogossos were horrors that even the Valyrians themselves preferred not to discuss openly, their existence a dark secret that underlay the glory of the Freehold. The discovery and taming of dragons had transformed the Valyrians from obscure shepherds into a people with the capacity to reshape the world. But capacity is not destiny, and power must be used to be effective. The path from local power to continental empire required something more than mere possession of dragons. It required the will to use that power and the wars to prove it. The first great test of Valyrian might came from the east, from an empire that had stood for thousands of years and saw itself as the rightful ruler of all civilized lands, a power that would not yield easily to any challenger. This was the old empire of Gis, and the clash between Gis and Valyria would determine the fate of Essos for millennia to come, establishing the patterns of dominance and resistance that would define the continent's history. Old Gis was ancient when Valyria was young, its civilization stretching back into the mists of prehistory, built upon the foundations of slavery and military discipline that had made it the dominant power of its age. The Ghiscari had conquered vast territories, establishing an empire that stretched across much of eastern Essos, their slave legions the envy of all who beheld them. Their capital, Old Gis, was protected by brick walls that legend attributed to Dragonstone the Great, the semi-mythical founder of their civilization. Walls that had never fallen in all the centuries of their existence. They had stood against siege and assault, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless enemies, become symbols of Ghiscari permanence and power that seemed unshakable. Their military prowess was legendary, with slave legions drilled to absolute obedience and tactical perfection, armies that had conquered everything they had been sent against. The Ghiscari looked out across their domains and saw no equals, only subjects and soon-to-be subjects, peoples who would eventually bow to the might of Old Gis.
When the Valyrians began expanding beyond their peninsula, establishing colonies and asserting control over trade routes, the Ghiscari viewed this with the disdain that old powers reserve for upstart newcomers. Who were these people to challenge the order that Gis had established, to dare to assert their own power in a world that already had masters? The Ghiscari sent armies to put the Valyrians in their place, to remind them that the world already had masters and they were not among them, to crush this nascent threat before it could grow into something more dangerous. Thus began the first of the Ghiscari Wars, conflicts that would be waged over centuries and would ultimately doom one of the two great powers, destroying a civilization that had stood for millennia and reshaping the political landscape of Essos forever. The Ghiscari had every reason to be confident in their ultimate victory, for they had numbers, organization, centuries of military tradition, and control of strategic positions throughout the region. What they did not have, what they could not conceive of as a decisive factor, were dragons, and this lack would prove to be their undoing. The first war must have been a revelation and a nightmare for the Ghiscari, a brutal lesson in the nature of power that would change their understanding of warfare forever. Ghiscari legions, among the finest infantry in the world, marched in perfect formation against the Valyrian positions, confident in their discipline and their training. And then the dragons came, not from the front where armies engage each other, not from the sides where cavalry might flank, but from above, where no shield wall could reach and no formation could protect them. Imagine the horror of that first engagement from the Ghiscari perspective, the sky darkening with wings until the sun itself was blotted out, the roar of dragons drowning out the commands of officers and the cries of dying men, and then the fire. Dragon fire burns hotter than any natural flame, hot enough to melt stone, certainly hot enough to reduce men in armor to ash in seconds, to create an inferno that would haunt the nightmares of survivors for the rest of their lives. The legendary discipline of the Ghiscari legions broke before that fire, and it was not a failure of courage, but a recognition of the impossible. They were being asked to stand firm while literally burning alive, while their comrades turned to torches around them, while the very air became too hot to breathe, and the screams of dying men filled their ears. The Valyrians won the First War, not through superior tactics or greater courage, but through the application of overwhelming force from a vector the Ghiscari had no way to counter, force that made all their training and discipline meaningless. But the Ghiscari were not a people to accept defeat easily, for they had built their empire through persistence and adaptation and would not surrender their dominance without a fight. They applied these qualities to the problem of dragons, developing new strategies and new weapons in the hopes of finding a way to counter the aerial threat. The Second War saw them attempting covered formations that might resist fire from above, giant crossbows that could potentially bring down a dragon, magical defenses provided by their own sorcerers who had been studying dragon lore in desperation. None of it worked, for the dragons were simply too powerful, too mobile, too numerous for any conventional strategy to overcome. The Valyrians won the Second War, then the Third, then the Fourth, each victory adding to their confidence and their power. The wars were not confined to the mainland, but spread to the Ghiscari colonies throughout the region, with the Valyrians systematically dismantling everything the Ghiscari had built over millennia. In the Third War, they conquered Gorgai, the main Ghiscari base in the Basilisk Isles, renaming it Gogossos and turning it into one of their own colonies, a place that would become infamous for the horrors that occurred there. In the Fourth War, they took Zamitar, the only major city the Ghiscari had established on the mainland of Sithorios, that mysterious and disease-ridden continent to the south. The Valyrians were systematically dismantling the Ghiscari Empire, reducing it piece by piece until nothing remained. The fifth and final war was not about conquest, but elimination, a deliberate decision by the Valyrians to eliminate the threat of Gis forever. The Dragon Lords gathered their forces and marched on the Ghiscari capital itself, determined to end the threat once and for all. The great brick walls that had stood for centuries, that had never been breached, that embodied Ghiscari power and permanence, were no match for concentrated dragon fire. The walls crumbled and melted and collapsed into rubble, their centuries of strength meaningless against the power of the dragons. But the Valyrians did not stop with breaching the walls, for they had come to destroy, not to conquer. They burned the entire city, every pyramid, every temple, every home, everything that had made Old Gis a wonder of the ancient world. The colossal structures that had defined Old Gis for thousands of years were reduced to slag and ash, their magnificence erased as if it had never existed. And when the fires finally died and the dragons departed, nothing remained but a field of destruction that stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to Valyrian power and a warning to all who might resist. And even this was not enough for the Valyrians, for they sowed the fields around Old Gis with salt, lime, and skulls. Salt to ensure nothing would grow there again, rendering the fertile lands barren for generations.
lime to make the soil toxic, poisoning the earth so thoroughly that even weeds could not take root, and skulls, the skulls of the defeated, as a warning to any who might think to rebuild what had been destroyed.
The survivors of Old Gis, those who had not died in the siege or the burning, were enslaved, their freedom taken as completely as their civilization had been destroyed. The Valyrians had observed that the Ghiscari built their power on slavery, and in a twist of irony that must have been deliberate, they decided to adopt this practice themselves. The defeated Ghiscari were put to work in the mines of the 14 Flames, laboring in conditions so brutal that death often came as a mercy, their suffering fueling the wealth and power of their conquerors. Over the generations that followed, these slaves and their descendants forgot their own language, forgot their own history, forgot everything except that they had once been something greater and had fallen. They learned to speak High Valyrian, the language of their conquerors, because knowing no other tongue was possible, their identity erased as thoroughly as their civilization had been. 3 cities survived from the old empire: Astapor, Meereen, and Yunkai, located on Slavers Bay. These were allowed to continue existing not out of Valyrian mercy, but because they were useful, serving as the primary slave markets for the region and providing the endless stream of human labor that the Valyrian economy demanded. The Ghiscari heritage in these cities survived only in fragments, in certain architectural styles, in a few traditions that had been allowed to persist, in the practice of slavery itself that had been the foundation of their civilization. But the great civilization that had ruled for millennia was gone, destroyed so thoroughly that it would never rise again, its legacy reduced to the suffering of its descendants and the ruins that marked where it had once stood. The Ghiscari Wars established several patterns that would define the Valyrian freehold throughout its existence, patterns of behavior that would shape their interactions with the wider world. First, they demonstrated that the Valyrians would use overwhelming force to achieve their objectives, showing no mercy to enemies who refused to submit to their will. Second, they showed that the dragons were the ultimate military asset, capable of winning wars that conventional forces could not, force that made all other forms of military power obsolete. Third, and perhaps most ominously, they showed that the Valyrians were willing to commit genocide to secure their position, that they would destroy entire civilizations rather than allow the possibility of future resistance. The destruction of Old Gis was not merely a military victory, but a conscious decision to erase an entire civilization from history, to ensure that no trace of Ghiscari power would survive to challenge Valyrian dominance. Having conquered the east, the Valyrians turned their attention westward, looking to expand their influence and control into new territories. For a time, they coexisted peacefully with the Rhoynar civilization that flourished along the Rhoyne, one of the mightiest rivers in the known world. The Rhoynar were an advanced culture in their own right, with powerful water magic that could command the river, and sophisticated cities that rivaled anything the Valyrians had built. The Valyrian outposts grew into towns and then into cities, and the Valyrians, particularly those of Volantis, began eyeing the Rhoynar territories with covetous eyes. Conflicts over trade rights and territorial boundaries increased, small skirmishes escalating into larger battles, and larger battles eventually becoming full-scale war. The Rhoynish Wars, as they came to be called, would last for generations and would end with the effective destruction of Rhoynar civilization, the greatest military response Valyria had ever mounted. The Rhoynar princes initially fought separately, each defending his own city-state and refusing to cooperate with his neighbors.
Princess Nymeria of Nysar argued for a united response, warning that divided they would fall to the dragon lords one by one. But her counsel went unheeded by princes who were more concerned with their own power than with the common threat. The princes believed their water magic and their military prowess would be sufficient to handle the Valyrian colonies, that their ancient arts would prove equal to the dragon lords. They won some early victories, proving that they were not easy prey and that their magic could indeed challenge the dragon lords. But then the Freehold itself took notice, and the full might of Valyria was brought to bear against the Rhoynar. Prince Ghiscari of Rhoynar emerged as the great Rhoynar hero, the leader who finally united the fractured city-states into a single military force capable of meeting the Valyrians on the battlefield. He assembled an army of 250,000 men, an absolutely massive force by any standard, and marched to meet the Valyrians, achieving victory after victory that seemed to prove that the Rhoynar could indeed defeat their dragon-riding enemies. At Rhoynar, they defeated a Valyrian army, and at Volantis they achieved their greatest triumph, defeating an army of 100,000 men, and most impressively, killing 2 dragons in the process and wounding a third. It seemed for a brief moment that the Rhoynar might actually win, that Prince Ghiscari had found the way to overcome the dragon lords and preserve his civilization. The Valyrian response was overwhelming, for they could not allow even the possibility that they might be defeated, could not permit other subject peoples to see that the dragon lords could be beaten. The Freehold mobilized not 3 dragons, as had fought at Volantis, but 300, a force so massive that some accounts say the sky was so filled with dragons that the sun itself was obscured. This was the full might of Valyria, unleashed, and nothing could stand against it. For 300 dragons attacking in concert created an inferno that no army could withstand. The final battle was not a battle, but a slaughter, as Prince Ghiscari's army, which had fought so bravely and won such victories, was annihilated.
The dragons turned the rivers themselves to steam, and the heat was so intense that men died before the flames even touched them, their lungs seared by breathing the superheated air. Prince Ghiscari himself was captured and forced to watch as his army burned and his people died, a cruel punishment that was meant to break his spirit and demonstrate the futility of resistance. The Valyrians caged him and displayed him like an animal, a warning to all who might resist their power, a symbol of what happened to those who dared challenge Valyrian dominance. According to legend, Ghiscari called down a curse upon the dragon lords before he died, a curse that some believe eventually manifested as the doom itself, the destruction of Valyria by forces beyond mortal control. Princess Nymeria, who had warned of this outcome, gathered what remained of her people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, as almost all the fighting men had died with Ghiscari's army. She loaded them onto ships, a fleet that legend numbers at 10,000 vessels, and led them in an exodus from their homeland, sailing for years seeking a place where they might rebuild, far from the reach of Valyrian power. Eventually, they found sanctuary in Dorne, the southernmost region of Westeros, where Princess Nymeria married Mors Martell and helped establish the united Dorne that would endure for centuries, a legacy of the civilization that had been destroyed. The Rhoynish Wars ended as the Ghiscari Wars had, with Valyrian victory and the destruction of an ancient civilization. The great Rhoynar cities along the Rhoyne were burned or abandoned, their magnificent water gardens turned to ruins, their temples crumbling into the river that had been the heart of their civilization. The Rhoyne still flowed, but the people who had made it great were gone,
scattered or dead or enslaved, their culture reduced to fragments that survived only in the memory of their descendants. The Valyrians built new colonies on the ruins of Rhoynar cities, and in time the very memory of the Rhoynar in Essos faded to legend and scattered ruins, their achievements forgotten or attributed to others. These wars established the Valyrian Freehold as the uncontested power of Essos, the dominant force that all others must acknowledge or be destroyed. From the Ghiscari colonies in the east to the ruins of the Rhoynar in the west, all acknowledged Valyrian supremacy, and all lived in fear of the dragons that enforced that supremacy. The dragons had proven themselves invincible, and the dragon lords had shown they would stop at nothing to maintain their dominance, creating an empire that would endure for millennia. The century after the Rhoynish Wars represented the absolute peak of Valyrian power, the moment when they controlled more territory, commanded more dragons, and wielded more influence than they would ever again. But peaks are followed by descents, and the Valyrians, in their pride and their power, could not see that their descent was approaching, that very forces that had made them great would eventually contribute to their undoing. At its zenith, the Valyrian Freehold stretched across distances that would take months to traverse, encompassing territories on multiple continents and asserting control over peoples and cultures from the Basilisk Isles in the south to the borders of the Forest of Qohor in the north. The empire, though they did not call it such, covered most of the western portion of Essos, all the lands from the Bone Mountains to the narrow sea beyond. It was the largest continuous political entity the world had ever seen, a dominion that had no equal in history, and it maintained this vast domain not through administrative genius alone, but through the ever-present threat of dragon fire, the knowledge that any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The free cities, those great urban centers that still endure in the present day, began their existence as Valyrian colonies, settlements established to project Valyrian power and extract resources from conquered territories. Volantis was among the first and greatest of these colonies, established as a forward base for Valyrian expansion into the lands of the Rhoyne. Lys, Myr, Tyrosh, Pentos, and others followed, each serving specific economic or strategic purposes within the larger Valyrian system. These cities were Valyrian in culture and governance, though they developed their own local characteristics over time, their ruling classes speaking High Valyrian and often including actual Dragon Lord families or their lesser relatives. The cities were connected to the capital and to each other through the famous dragon roads, straight and perfectly constructed highways that allowed for rapid movement of troops and trade, binding the empire together through infrastructure as well as fear. Qohor and Norvos, founded in regions farther from the capital, served different purposes in the Valyrian system. Qohor, deep in the forests, became famous for its timber, and later for its smiths, who apparently learned some secrets of metalwork from Valyrian masters, and eventually became the only people capable of working Valyrian steel. Norvos, in the hills to the north, provided metals and served as a buffer against the wildlands beyond, protecting the more valuable territories from the dangers that lurked in the unknown. Each colony enriched the freehold, sending tribute and resources back to the capital, while benefiting from the protection and prestige that came with being part of the greatest civilization of the age. Even Braavos, that most independent-minded of the free cities, began as a Valyrian creation, though not an intentional one. Braavos was founded by escaped slaves who stole ships and fled into the foggy islands north of the Valyrian colonies, hiding their city for a century before revealing its existence to the wider world. The fact that they needed to hide for so long speaks to the thoroughness of Valyrian control, for one did not simply escape the Freehold and establish a new life elsewhere. The dragons would find you, and punishment would be severe, for the Valyrians did not tolerate the loss of their property, human or otherwise. The island of Dragonstone represented the westernmost extent of Valyrian expansion, a fortress colony established on a massive rock in the narrow sea roughly 200 years before the Doom. Dragonstone was strange even by Valyrian standards, carved from the black volcanic stone of the island into forms that resembled dragons in every chamber and tower. It served as a monitoring station, allowing the Freehold to keep watch on the lands of Westeros across the water. But the Valyrians never attempted to conquer the Seven Kingdoms, and scholars have debated why ever since. For Westeros had resources, certainly, timber and iron and fertile farmland, all things that an expanding empire could use. But it was also distant, relatively poor by Valyrian standards, and conquering it would have required significant investment of resources for uncertain return. The most likely explanation is that the Dragon Lords simply never saw Westeros as worth the effort, for they had more pressing concerns closer to home, more valuable territories to exploit, more worthy enemies to crush. Westeros was a backwater, and backwaters could wait. Daily life in the city of Valyria itself would have been unlike anything else in the known world, a constant reminder of the power and ambition that had created the greatest civilization of the age. The capital was home to perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, though exact population figures were never recorded or did not survive the Doom, leaving us to guess at the scale of this magnificent city. The city was divided into distinct districts based on social status and function, a physical manifestation of the hierarchies that governed Valyrian society. The highest nobility, those Dragon Lord families with the most power and prestige, lived in the structures built closest to the volcanic face itself, where the heat and energy of the mountain could be most directly felt. These were not merely homes, but palaces carved directly into the mountain were built against it, protected by magical wards that prevented the heat and toxic fumes from harming the inhabitants. The architecture throughout the city reflected the Valyrian philosophy of demonstrating power through physical grandeur, with buildings that did not merely house people, but made statements about the civilization that had created them. The topless towers pierced the smoke-filled sky, their peaks lost in the clouds and volcanic ash that perpetually hung over the city, symbols of ambition that seemed to reach toward the heavens themselves. Bridges connected structures across impossible distances, appearing to float on nothing but air, held aloft by magic and engineering that even the Valyrians' own descendants could not replicate. Sphinxes with dragon bodies and human faces lined the grand boulevards, their eyes set with garnets that seemed to glow in the light of the numerous fires that burned throughout the city, guardians that watched over the streets and perhaps served some magical purpose as well. At the city's heart stood the Anagrin, the great structure where the blood mages performed their most powerful and most terrible rituals, a place of darkness and power that was the center of Valyrian sorcery. What exactly happened within the Anagrin remains largely unknown, as those who entered its halls either kept its secrets or did not survive to share them, their knowledge dying with them in the Doom. It was likely here that the darkest experiments took place, where the boundaries between human and beast were deliberately blurred, where sacrifices were made to fuel spells of immense power, where the blood mages pushed the limits of what was possible and what was permissible. The anagrin represented the heart of Valyrian sorcery, and it would have been heavily guarded and restricted, with only the most powerful blood mages granted entry. The city contained forges unlike any others, where master smiths worked Valyrian steel, using techniques that combined metallurgy with magic, folding the metal thousands of times and infusing it with spells that gave it supernatural properties. The forges were fueled by dragon fire when necessary, creating temperatures that no normal fire could achieve, heat that was essential to the forging process. The smiths were highly valued craftsmen, their skills passed down through generations within specific families, knowledge that was more precious than gold. Markets filled entire districts where goods from across the Freehold's vast territories were bought and sold, silks from the east competing with timber from the forests of Qohor, slaves from Slaver's Bay standing in pens next to captured animals from Sithorios, spices and gems and rare metals and exotic foods all flowing into Valyria as tribute or trade. The markets would have been polyglot places where High Valyrian mixed with dozens of other languages, where fortunes were made and lost in single transactions, where merchants from distant lands came to trade and marveled at the wealth and wonders on display. The practice of slavery permeated Valyrian society, adopted from their defeated enemies in Gis and expanded into something even more extensive and brutal. Slaves performed all the hard labor that kept the city functioning, working in the forges, serving in the great houses as servants and accountants and tutors, and laboring in the mines beneath the 14 flames. The mines were the engine that drove Valyrian wealth, extracting the gold and silver and precious materials that funded their expansion and enabled their magical works. But these mines were also charnel houses where slaves died by the thousands, laboring in conditions so brutal that death often came as a release rather than a tragedy. The Valyrians had discovered that the volcanic regions contained exceptionally rich deposits of precious metals, far more concentrated than could be found elsewhere, gold and silver and other rare materials useful in magical workings.
Extracting these materials required digging deeper and deeper into the mountains, following veins of ore through solid rock, working in chambers where the heat alone was almost unbearable. The slaves who performed this labor were treated as expendable, easily replaced by more captives from the constant wars that the Freehold waged. The conditions they endured defy adequate description, for the heat in the lower levels was intense enough to kill within hours for those unaccustomed to it, and the air was thick with toxic fumes from volcanic gases. Slaves worked with minimal tools, breaking rock by hand and hauling it back to the surface through narrow passages. Accidents were constant, tunnels collapsed, slaves fell into underground lakes of magma, and the fumes overcame workers who dropped dead in the passages. Beyond the ordinary dangers of mining in volcanic regions, the slaves faced another threat that was uniquely terrifying: the fireworms. These creatures, related to dragons but lacking wings or legs, were serpentine beasts that dwelt in the deepest, hottest chambers of the mountains. A fireworm could grow to immense size, generating intense heat from their bodies and breathing fire that could melt through solid rock. Slaves who encountered fireworms were almost always killed, incinerated before they could even think to run. Slave revolts in the mines were common,
which speaks to how desperate the conditions must have been. Revolting in a Valyrian mine was almost certainly suicidal, for the slaves had limited weapons, no dragons, no magic, and nowhere to run. But people will reach a point where even hopeless rebellion seems preferable to continued suffering, and that point was reached repeatedly in the volcanic depths. The Valyrians had the resources to put down these revolts, sending in dragon lords when necessary to incinerate rebellious slaves by the hundreds, and using blood mages to break wills and instill terror. The mining operation was so extensive and the death toll so massive that multiple sources state the number of those who died in the Valyrian mines defies comprehension. Over 5,000 years of active mining, extracting ever more material to feed ever greater ambitions, the cumulative death toll could easily have reached the millions, a number so staggering that it becomes difficult to comprehend. The need for constant replacement of this slave labor force drove much of Valyrian foreign policy, providing the justification for endless conquest and the enslavement of conquered peoples. Wars provided fresh captives, and the defeat of Gis alone must have supplied tens or hundreds of thousands of slaves for the mines. The Rhinish Wars added more, and smaller conquests throughout the Freehold's territories ensured a steady supply. When there was no war, the Valyrians bred their slaves, treating them as livestock to be managed for maximum production, ensuring that there would always be new generations to replace those who died. The economic logic was simple, if morally abhorrent, for the mines produced wealth that funded expansion and magnificence, and expansion produced more slaves to work the mines. It was a self-reinforcing cycle, at least as long as the supply of conquerable territory held out, and as long as the geological conditions remained stable. The Valyrians saw no reason to change a system that worked so effectively from their perspective, for it required human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. But that suffering was borne by others, and thus irrelevant to their concerns. But the very success of this system contained within it a threat that the Valyrians apparently never fully appreciated or chose to ignore. For mining on such a massive scale, digging deeper and deeper into volcanic mountains that were already geologically unstable, created stresses in the rock and in the magma chambers below. The ancient systems that kept the 14 flames in their delicate balance between active volcanism and catastrophic eruption were being disturbed by thousands of tunnels and chambers, by the removal of millions of tons of rock, by the constant weakening of the mountain structures. Some scholars, including Septon Barth, who studied Valyrian history extensively, speculated that the Valyrians used magical spells to control the 14 flames, keeping the volcanoes from erupting catastrophically while still maintaining them as sources of heat and material. If this was true, and it seems likely given Valyrian magical capabilities, then these spells would have required constant maintenance and renewal, and any failure in these protective magics could have catastrophic consequences. The Valyrians were essentially living on top of 14 active volcanoes, while simultaneously destabilizing them through mining, trusting in their magic to keep disaster at bay. Over the centuries, there must have been signs that this situation was unsustainable. Increased seismic activity, changes in the pattern of volcanic emissions, minor eruptions that served as warnings of greater instability. But the Valyrians, in their pride and their certainty that their magic could control any threat, apparently dismissed these warnings or failed to recognize them as what they were. For they had controlled the 14 flames for thousands of years. The slaves in the mines, closer to the source of the danger than any dragon lord in his palace, might have noticed changes that their masters dismissed, for they would have felt the tremors and smelled the changes in the volcanic gases. But who would listen to the warnings of slaves?
Their testimony meant nothing in Valyrian society, for they were tools to be used and discarded, not people whose opinions mattered. The mining operation beneath the 14 Flames represented the Valyrian approach to power in microcosm, pushing any boundary, paying any price, risking any danger in pursuit of wealth and magnificence. The suffering of others was irrelevant, the warnings of nature were ignored, and the magical solution to every problem created dependencies and risks that went unacknowledged. And beneath it all, literally and metaphorically, lay a foundation that was slowly crumbling, destabilized by the very actions that had made them powerful. When that foundation finally gave way, the entire edifice would come crashing down in fire and ruin.
In the year that would later be remembered as 114 years before Aegon's conquest, something extraordinary occurred in the House of Targaryen. Daenys, the young maiden daughter of Lord Rhoynar Targaryen, began experiencing dreams unlike any she had known before, prophetic visions of terrible clarity and power. She saw Valyria burning, the 14 Flames erupting in concert and tearing the peninsula apart, dragons dying, and thousands upon thousands of people perishing in a single day of fire and fury. She woke from these dreams screaming, and when the visions continued night after night with increasing intensity, she finally went to her father. Daenys, the Dreamer, as she would later be known, was not the first or only Targaryen to experience prophetic dreams, but hers proved to be among the most significant in their family's history. The Targaryens, like many families of Valyrian blood, seemed to possess certain individuals in each generation who displayed heightened sensitivity to magic and fate, who could see what others could not. Some could bond with dragons more easily than others. Some showed particular aptitude for sorcery, and some, like Daenys, received visions of what was to come. These gifts were never universal within the bloodline, suggesting that whatever quality enabled them was recessive or required specific circumstances to manifest. Lord Rhoynar Targaryen faced a choice that would define his family's future, for his daughter claimed to have seen the destruction of Valyria, a claim that seemed impossible. The Freehold had stood for 5,000 years, and it was the most powerful civilization in the known world, protected by hundreds of dragons and the greatest sorcerers ever known. How could such a power fall? The rational response would have been to dismiss Daenys' visions as nightmares, to have her examined by blood mages who might help her manage these disturbing dreams. Many of the other Dragon Lord families, when word of her visions spread through the gossipy circles of Valyrian high society, did exactly this. They laughed at the Targaryens, made jokes about prophetic ravings, and suggested that if the Targaryens were so worried, they might want to sell their properties at bargain prices. But Rhoynar Targaryen made a different choice, whether he truly believed his daughter's visions, or whether he saw them as warnings that prudence required heeding even if they proved false. He chose to act, beginning quietly to liquidate his family's holdings in the Freehold and prepare for departure. The destination he chose was Dragonstone, the Valyrian fortress colony on the massive volcanic rock in the narrow sea, looking out toward the distant shores of Westeros. Dragonstone was remote by Valyrian standards, far from the center of power and influence, but it was defensible, large enough to support a noble household, and far enough from Valyria that if Daenys' visions proved true, they might survive. The migration was a massive undertaking, for Rhoynar brought his entire household, his family, his dragons, his slaves, his movable wealth, his most valued possessions. This was not a temporary relocation, but a permanent move, though he probably could not have explained this to most of those who accompanied him without revealing Daenerys' visions and inviting the mockery he was trying to avoid. The dragons alone would have been the journey complex, for transporting dragons over such distances requires either flying them or shipping them, both of which present their own challenges. The Targaryens had 5 dragons at this time, including Balerion the Black Dread, who would later be ridden by Aegon the Conqueror, and these dragons would be the key to their future power. Other families of Valyrian blood also left the peninsula before the Doom, though whether inspired by their own prophets or simply by coincidence is unclear. House Velaryon, who had been established on Driftmark, and House Celtigar of Claw Isle both survived because they were not in Valyria when the catastrophe struck. But these houses did not leave 12 years in advance. Their survival was more fortune than foresight. The Targaryens were the only major Dragonlord family to receive clear warning and act decisively, and this decision would save them when all others perished. The question of why so few heeded warnings, assuming others also noticed signs of the coming disaster, leads into deeper mysteries about the nature of Valyrian society in its final years. There is some evidence in the fragmentary records that do survive that Valyria was experiencing internal problems before the Doom, mentions of increased conflict between the Dragonlord families, references to magical difficulties, spells that weren't working as reliably as they once did. Whether these were genuine omens of coming disaster or simply the normal level of dysfunction in a complex society is impossible to determine with certainty. The most disturbing theory proposed by some scholars, though impossible to prove, is that some Valyrians did know disaster was coming, but were powerless or unwilling to prevent it. If the doom was caused by magical systems failing, by spells that controlled the 14 flames breaking down, then those responsible for maintaining those spells would have known. Did they try to fix the problem and fail? Did they warn others and were ignored? Or did they keep silent, hoping to solve the issue without creating panic? We will never know, because anyone who might have answered these questions died in the conflagration. The Targaryens on Dragonstone had to watch as the years passed and nothing happened. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and still the doom did not come. Daenerys' visions must have seemed increasingly questionable, perhaps just dreams after all, disturbing nightmares with no basis in reality. Other Dragonlord families certainly thought so, sending messages to Dragonstone mocking them for their cowardice or suggesting they might want to sell their properties at bargain prices.
The pressure to return, to reclaim their proper place in Valyrian society, must have been substantial, for the Targaryens had been a respected family with a position to maintain. But Aenar remained on Dragonstone, whether he still believed in the visions or simply decided that having made the move, he would not unmake it. His decision to stay, to remain in what must have seemed like voluntary exile, saved his family and ensured that Dragonlord blood would survive beyond the doom. The Targaryens on Dragonstone continued their lives, adapting to their new home, perhaps looking west toward Westeros and wondering about the lands across the water, not knowing that their descendants would eventually conquer those lands and rule them for nearly 3 centuries. Daenerys the Dreamer's visions proved tragically, catastrophically accurate. For 12 years after she saw the destruction in her dreams, Valyria burned. Every Dragonlord family that had mocked the Targaryens, every house that had bought Targaryen properties at what they thought were bargain prices, every sorcerer and merchant and slave and citizen who had remained in the Freehold's capital, all of them died in a single day.
The Targaryens, because of one girl's visions and one man's willingness to be called a coward rather than risk his family, were the only major Dragonlord house to survive. The day began like any other in the Valyrian Freehold, with the sun rising over the 14 flames and casting long shadows from the topless towers of the capital. Dragons took flight from their lairs, carrying riders on errands of trade or politics or pleasure. In the markets, merchants hawked their goods, and in the palaces, dragon lords schemed. In the mines beneath the mountains, slaves labored and died as they had for millennia. Nothing suggested that this day would be different from the 5,000 years that had come before. Nothing warned that by sunset, the greatest civilization the world had ever known would be gone. The exact sequence of events will never be fully known, because almost no one survived to record them, and those few who did were far from the center of the catastrophe. What can be reconstructed from fragmentary accounts, from the geological evidence visible in the ruins centuries later, and from the reports of survivors in distant parts of the Freehold, suggests a cataclysm of unprecedented scale and fury. The doom of Valyria was not a single event, but rather a cascade of disasters that compounded upon each other, each making the next worse, until the cumulative effect was the annihilation of everything within hundreds of miles of the capital. It began with the volcanoes, for all 14 of the 14 flames erupted simultaneously, or near enough that the difference was academic for anyone trying to survive. This synchronicity strongly suggests that whatever caused the doom affected the volcanic system as a whole, rather than being a natural eruption of one volcano that triggered the others. Each volcano sent massive plumes of superheated ash and rock into the sky, columns that reached miles into the atmosphere. The ash was so thick it turned day into night across the entire region, and anyone breathing it directly would have died within minutes, their lungs seared and filled with volcanic debris. But the volcanic columns were merely the opening act, for what followed was worse. Pyroclastic flows, cascades of superheated gas and rock fragments, rolled down the sides of the 14 flames at hundreds of miles an hour. The temperature in these flows exceeded 1,000 degrees, hot enough that metal would melt and wood would spontaneously combust before the flow even reached it. The mountains themselves came apart, and 5 centuries later, travelers who dared approach the ruins reported that the landscape had been fundamentally altered. Where once the Valyrian peninsula was a continuous landmass, now it was fragmented into numerous smaller islands, separated by what came to be called the Smoking Sea. The violence required to shatter an entire peninsula suggests that the volcanic eruptions were accompanied by earthquakes of unimaginable magnitude, possibly triggered by the same cause, or perhaps triggered by the eruptions themselves, as the magma chambers beneath the mountains emptied in a catastrophic release. These earthquakes would have toppled even the magically reinforced structures of Valyria, with the topless towers falling and their peaks lost in the ash clouds. Palaces built to last for millennia collapsed in minutes. The magical wards that had protected the city from the volcanic heat failed or were simply overwhelmed by forces beyond their capacity to resist. Entire districts vanished into cracks that opened in the earth, were buried under avalanches of volcanic material, or were inundated when the sea rushed in to fill the newly created basin where solid ground had been moments before. The molten rock that erupted from the 14 flames flew 1,000 feet into the air, not the slow lava flow of gentler eruptions, but an explosive ejection of magma at velocities that defy description. The sky rained molten rock, dragonglass, and fire, setting ablaze buildings not yet destroyed by earthquakes or pyroclastic flows. The heat was so intense that lakes boiled away in minutes, or worse, turned to acid for some combination of volcanic chemistry and possibly magical contamination. Anyone caught in the open was simply erased, burned to nothing so completely that not even bones remained. The dragons, those seemingly invincible creatures that had made Valyria the dominant power of the age, died. The texts say that dragonfire could not kill a dragon, that their scales resisted normal flame, but the doom was not normal fire. It was something unprecedented, a combination of volcanic heat, toxic gases, and possibly magical energies running wild as the spells that had controlled them for millennia all failed at once. Dragons fell from the sky, overcome by the poisonous atmosphere or killed by volcanic debris. Dragons in their lairs suffocated or were buried alive when the mountains collapsed. The hundreds of dragons that had been Valyria's ultimate weapon and ultimate symbol were reduced to corpses and bones, dead alongside their riders.
The death toll defies estimation, for the city of Valyria alone probably held hundreds of thousands of people, possibly more, and the surrounding region supported a much larger population. When the doom struck, everyone in the immediate vicinity died. Those slightly farther away, beyond the range of the initial pyroclastic flows and earthquakes, faced death from the ashfall, from the poisoning of water sources, from the collapse of all infrastructure that might have helped them survive. Refugees fleeing the disaster carried stories of horror with them, tales of trying to run while the very ground split beneath their feet, of watching family members disappear into cracks in the earth or be consumed by fire from the sky. The tsunamis generated by the doom struck coastlines hundreds of miles away, for when massive amounts of land suddenly drop or are destroyed, the sea rushes in to fill the void, creating waves of enormous size, moving at tremendous speed. East of Valyria, the Isle of Cedars acted as a buffer that protected Slaver's Bay from the worst of the waves, but the isle itself was devastated. The cities of Velos and Ghiscari on the Isle of Cedars were swept away completely, destroyed so thoroughly that they were never rebuilt. The isle has remained uninhabited ever since, a haunted place where no one wants to live. Other coastal regions reported waves that came without warning, walls of water that swept over harbors and low-lying areas, drowning thousands. Ships at sea reported being tossed about by swells that came from nowhere, and some vessels were simply never heard from again, presumably swamped by the chaotic seas that followed the doom. The magical consequences of the doom may have been as significant as the physical destruction, for when Valyria died, magic throughout the world seemed to diminish. The glass candles went dark, spells that had worked reliably for centuries stopped functioning or worked unreliably, and in the Citadel in Westeros, maesters who had been skeptical about magic pointed to this as proof that it had never been real. But those who understood magic better recognized it differently, understanding that Valyria had been a nexus, a focal point where magical power concentrated. With that nexus destroyed, magic became more diffuse, harder to access, weaker in its manifestations. The smoke and ash from the doom affected climate across the known world for months or possibly years afterward, reducing sunlight and causing crop failures that led to famine in regions far from Valyria itself. This wasn't on the scale of the long night that had occurred thousands of years earlier, but it was significant enough to cause widespread suffering.
The smoking sea, created by the doom and existing still in the present day, is a place of horror and mystery, with waters perpetually covered in mist and fog, heated from below by volcanic activity that continues centuries after the initial catastrophe. Ships that attempt to sail through the smoking sea often disappear or return with crews afflicted by strange diseases, and the ruins of Valyria can be glimpsed through the mists but remain largely unexplored because approaching them is so dangerous. What caused the doom remains one of history's greatest mysteries, with several theories existing but none proven. The most common explanation is that it was a natural catastrophe, a coincidence of volcanic timing where all 14 of the 14 flames happened to erupt at once. This seems unlikely given the improbability of such perfect synchronization, but it remains possible. Septon Barth and some maesters theorized that Valyrian spells controlling the volcanoes failed, either through neglect or because the magical systems required for their maintenance had degraded over time. This seems more plausible, suggesting that the Valyrians' own hubris in trying to control such massive geological forces contributed to their destruction. Some religious figures claimed that the doom was divine punishment for Valyrian sins, pointing to the practice of incest, to the blood magic, to the cruelties inflicted on slaves. Whether one accepts supernatural explanations or not, the moralizing response tells us something about how the doom was received by others, with a mixture of horror at the scale of destruction and a certain grim satisfaction that the mighty had been brought low. A more disturbing theory, supported by fragmentary evidence, suggests that enemies of Valyria might have somehow caused the doom through magical sabotage, weaponizing the volcanic systems through sorcery. Whether any enemy possessed both the knowledge and power to exploit such a vulnerability remains unknown. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the doom was the result of Valyrian magical experimentation going catastrophically wrong, for if they were trying something new, pushing magical boundaries as they had always done, they might have triggered a cascade effect that destroyed everything. Whatever the cause, the result was clear and devastating. In a single day, the greatest civilization the world had known was erased. Valyria fell from the height of its power to utter annihilation, with no warning and no chance to save itself. The topless towers became ruins, the dragons died, and the Dragon Lord families were extinguished. 5,000 years of history, of magical knowledge, of artistic achievement, all of it was lost. The doom of Valyria stands as perhaps the single most catastrophic day in the history of the known world, a cataclysm that changed everything that came after and left scars that remain visible centuries later. The pressure to return, to reclaim their proper place in Valyrian society, must have been substantial, for the Targaryens had been a respected family with a position to maintain. But Rhoynar remained on Dragonstone, whether he still believed in the visions or simply decided that having made the move, he would not unmake it. His decision to stay, to remain in what must have seemed like voluntary exile, saved his family and ensured that Dragon Lord blood would survive beyond the doom. The Targaryens on Dragonstone continued their lives, adapting to their new home, perhaps looking west toward Westeros and wondering about the lands across the water, not knowing that their descendants would eventually conquer those lands and rule them for nearly 3 centuries. Daenys the Dreamer's visions proved tragically, catastrophically accurate. For 12 years after she saw the destruction in her dreams, Valyria burned. Every Dragon Lord family that had mocked the Targaryens, every house that had bought Targaryen properties at what they thought were bargain prices, every sorcerer and merchant and slave and citizen who had remained in the Freehold's capital, all of them died in a single day. The Targaryens, because of one girl's visions and one man's willingness to be called a coward rather than risk his family, were the only major Dragonlord house to survive. The day began like any other in the Valyrian Freehold, with the sun rising over the 14 flames and casting long shadows from the topless towers of the capital. Dragons took flight from their lairs, carrying riders on errands of trade or politics or pleasure. In the markets, merchants hawked their goods, and in the palaces, dragon lords schemed. In the mines beneath the mountains, slaves labored and died as they had for millennia. Nothing suggested that this day would be different from the 5,000 years that had come before. Nothing warned that by sunset, the greatest civilization the world had ever known would be gone. The exact sequence of events will never be fully known, because almost no one survived to record them, and those few who did were far from the center of the catastrophe. What can be reconstructed from fragmentary accounts, from the geological evidence visible in the ruins centuries later, and from the reports of survivors in distant parts of the Freehold, suggests a cataclysm of unprecedented scale and fury. The doom of Valyria was not a single event, but rather a cascade of disasters that compounded upon each other, each making the next worse, until the cumulative effect was the annihilation of everything within hundreds of miles of the capital. It began with the volcanoes, for all 14 of the 14 flames erupted simultaneously, or near enough that the difference was academic for anyone trying to survive. This synchronicity strongly suggests that whatever caused the doom affected the volcanic system as a whole, rather than being a natural eruption of one volcano that triggered the others. Each volcano sent massive plumes of superheated ash and rock into the sky, columns that reached miles into the atmosphere. The ash was so thick it turned day into night across the entire region, and anyone breathing it directly would have died within minutes, their lungs seared and filled with volcanic debris. But the volcanic columns were merely the opening act, for what followed was worse. Pyroclastic flows, cascades of superheated gas and rock fragments, rolled down the sides of the 14 flames at hundreds of miles an hour. The temperature in these flows exceeded 1,000 degrees, hot enough that metal would melt and wood would spontaneously combust before the flow even reached it. The mountains themselves came apart, and 5 centuries later, travelers who dared approach the ruins reported that the landscape had been fundamentally altered. Where once the Valyrian peninsula was a continuous landmass, now it was fragmented into numerous smaller islands, separated by what came to be called the Smoking Sea. The violence required to shatter an entire peninsula suggests that the volcanic eruptions were accompanied by earthquakes of unimaginable magnitude, possibly triggered by the same cause, or perhaps triggered by the eruptions themselves, as the magma chambers beneath the mountains emptied in a catastrophic release. These earthquakes would have toppled even the magically reinforced structures of Valyria, with the topless towers falling and their peaks lost in the ash clouds. Palaces built to last for millennia collapsed in minutes. The magical wards that had protected the city from the volcanic heat failed or were simply overwhelmed by forces beyond their capacity to resist. Entire districts vanished into cracks that opened in the earth, were buried under avalanches of volcanic material, or were inundated when the sea rushed in to fill the newly created basin where solid ground had been moments before. The molten rock that erupted from the 14 flames flew 1,000 feet into the air, not the slow lava flow of gentler eruptions, but an explosive ejection of magma at velocities that defy description. The sky rained molten rock, dragon glass, and fire, setting ablaze buildings not yet destroyed by earthquakes or pyroclastic flows. The heat was so intense that lakes boiled away in minutes, or worse, turned to acid for some combination of volcanic chemistry and possibly magical contamination. Anyone caught in the open was simply erased, burned to nothing so completely that not even bones remained. The dragons, those seemingly invincible creatures that had made Valyria the dominant power of the age, died. The texts say that dragon fire could not kill a dragon, that their scales resisted normal flame, but the doom was not normal fire. It was something unprecedented, a combination of volcanic heat, toxic gases, and possibly magical energies running wild as the spells that had controlled them for millennia all failed at once. Dragons fell from the sky, overcome by the poisonous atmosphere, or killed by volcanic debris. Dragons in their lairs suffocated or were buried alive when the mountains collapsed. The hundreds of dragons that had been Valyria's ultimate weapon and ultimate symbol were reduced to corpses and bones, dead alongside their riders.
Among all this chaos, some positive developments occurred. Braavos, the secret city that had been founded by escaped slaves and had hidden its existence for over a century, finally revealed itself openly. With the Freehold destroyed, Braavos no longer needed to fear discovery and punishment, and the city entered into diplomatic relations with other powers, becoming a significant player in Essos politics. The Braavosi, with their relatively egalitarian society and their ban on slavery, represented a different path than the other free cities, though their influence was limited by their relatively late emergence as an open power. The century of blood eventually ended not through any single peace agreement or decisive victory, but through gradual exhaustion. The various powers realized that continued warfare was destroying their ability to function economically, and that the benefits of trade and stable borders outweighed the potential gains from continued conflict. Alliances became less fluid, borders more stable, and trade routes more secure. The free cities settled into an equilibrium where each retained independence but acknowledged certain spheres of influence, and the Dothraki Khalasars continued raiding, but were increasingly avoided or bought off rather than confronted directly. The most significant long-term consequence of the Century of Blood was the permanent fragmentation of what had been the Valyrian Freehold. There would be no new empire to replace it, only a complex patchwork of independent cities, minor kingdoms, nomadic peoples, and dangerous wastelands. The unity that Valyria had imposed, however brutal, was gone forever, and trade became more complicated, requiring negotiations with multiple powers rather than operating under a single system. Culture began to diverge as the various regions developed their own identities rather than conforming to Valyrian standards, and magic continued to fade during this period. Without the nexus of power that Valyria had represented, without the constant practice and systematic study that Valyrian blood mages had performed, magical knowledge diminished, skills were lost, and spells stopped working or were forgotten. By the end of the Century of Blood, magic was widely regarded as dead or dying, something that had existed in the past but was no longer a significant force in the world. The glass candles remained dark,
The few dragons that had survived the doom elsewhere eventually died, and no one could hatch new ones. Magic became a matter of stories and histories, rather than a practical concern, a relic of a bygone age that would never return. The Century of Blood demonstrated that while Valyria could be destroyed, the consequences of its existence could not be erased. The systems it had established, the dependencies it had created, the migrations it had caused, all of these persisted. The slave economies of Slaver's Bay continued because no one knew how to run those societies without slavery, and the free cities maintained Valyrian cultural elements because that was their heritage. For better or worse, the scars of Valyrian conquest remained visible across Essos, in ruined cities, altered landscapes, and populations that carried Valyrian blood or language. When the chaos finally subsided and the world began to stabilize again, it was clear that an age had ended. The era of Valyrian dominance was over, and the age that followed would be defined by political fragmentation, by the gradual diminishment of magic, by societies trying to rebuild on the ruins of what had been lost. It was a smaller world in many ways, less connected, less ambitious, less certain of its power to reshape reality. The giants had fallen, and what remained were merely humans trying to survive in a world that had been made for giants. 4 centuries after the doom, the ruins of Valyria remained forbidden territory, avoided by all but the most desperate or foolhardy. The smoking sea that now covers much of what was once the Valyrian peninsula is perpetually shrouded in mists, heated from below by volcanic activity that continues unabated. Ships that attempt to navigate these waters often disappear without trace, and those that do return carry crews afflicted with grayscale, madness, or other afflictions. The very air in the region is said to be toxic, poisoned by something more than simple volcanic gases. Some believe the area is cursed, that the ghosts of the millions who died there still linger, angry and malevolent. The few travelers who have glimpsed the ruins through the mists speak of impossible sights, buildings that somehow still stand despite 4 centuries of neglect and geological violence. Dragons or creatures that look like dragons flying through the ash-choked sky above the ruins, and things moving in the mist that do not appear to be human or animal, but something else entirely. These reports are treated with skepticism by rational people, but enough sailors and adventurers have told similar stories that there's likely some truth beneath the exaggeration. The most dramatic evidence comes from documented attempts to reclaim treasures from the ruins. Garyon Lannister, a younger brother of Tywin Lannister, journeyed to Valyria seeking to recover Bright Roar, the lost Valyrian steel sword of House Lannister. He sailed from Lannisport with a ship full of hired swords and dreams of glory, and neither the ship nor any of its crew were ever seen again. The Lannister family still considers him missing rather than dead, but everyone knows the truth. Valyria claimed him, as it has claimed so many others. Euron Greyjoy claimed to have sailed to Valyria and returned, displaying a dragon horn that he said came from the ruins. Whether his claim was true or an elaborate deception remains debatable, but if he did venture to Valyria and survive, it would make him one of very few to do so. His willingness to risk such a journey speaks to either incredible bravery or tremendous madness, possibly both.
More officially, Volantis sent a fleet to attempt to reclaim Valyria, to reassert control over the ruins and claim whatever treasures might still exist there. The fleet sailed into the smoking sea and was never heard from again. Every ship, every soldier, every sailor simply vanished. Volantis did not send another expedition, for the lesson was clear. Valyria's destruction was so complete,
its ruins so dangerous that even 4 centuries later they remained effectively impregnable. The most terrifying account of what might exist in the ruins comes from the story of Princess Aeria Targaryen and Balerion the Black Dread. In the year 56 after Aegon's conquest, Princess Aeria, who had claimed Balerion as her mount despite being a young and inexperienced rider, disappeared for more than a year. When she finally reappeared in King's Landing, she was dying. Grand Maester Bennifer and Septon Barth examined her and found her body infested with creatures that defied description, worms with faces, snakes with hands, things that burned her from the inside out even as they killed her. Barth concluded that Balerion, uncontrollable by his young rider, had flown to his birthplace in Valyria, and that while there, both dragon and rider were exposed to something that should not exist. The creatures that killed Princess Aeria were speculated to be remnants of Valyrian blood magic experiments that survived in the ruins, and after this incident, it was decreed that any ship suspected of having visited Valyria would be forbidden from docking in Westeros. Despite the dangers and the centuries of neglect, the ruins almost certainly still contain treasures that would be invaluable to the present age. Valyrian steel weapons of unknown number lie somewhere in the collapsed palaces and buried vaults, for the Valyrians hoarded spellbooks, magical artifacts, precious metals, and works of art. Most of it would have been destroyed in the Doom or is inaccessible beneath volcanic debris or the smoking sea, but surely some survived in sealed chambers or protected vaults. Anyone who could safely retrieve even a fraction of what remains would become immediately wealthy beyond measure. The magical knowledge lost with Valyria represents perhaps the greatest tragedy from a scholarly perspective, for the Valyrians had systematized magic, turning it into a science with predictable rules and repeatable results. Their understanding of blood magic, fire magic, the creation of Valyrian steel, the taming of dragons, and the construction of magical structures, all of this knowledge died with them. Later civilizations have attempted to rediscover these secrets through experimentation, studying old texts, or examining surviving artifacts, but they work with fragmentary information and can never fully reconstruct what was lost. The only exception is Qohor, where the master smiths retained the ability to rework Valyrian steel, though not to create it anew from raw materials. How Qohoric smiths preserved this knowledge when it was lost everywhere else remains a mystery, but whatever the reason, Qohoric smiths are the only ones in the world who can rework Valyrian steel, making them invaluable despite their secrecy. The political legacy of Valyria extends beyond the physical ruins and lost knowledge. The Targaryen conquest of Westeros, which reshaped that continent's history for 3 centuries, was a direct consequence of the Doom. The Targaryens on Dragonstone, isolated and possessing the last major flight of dragons in the world, eventually decided to use those dragons to conquer the 7 kingdoms. Aegon's conquest established a dynasty that would rule until Robert's Rebellion, influencing every aspect of Westerosi culture and politics. The Iron Throne itself, forged from 1,000 swords by dragonfire, stands as a monument to Valyrian power transplanted to a new land. The free cities that arose from Valyrian colonies continue to influence events in the present day, with their wealth, their culture, their conflicts, all tracing roots back to their Valyrian origins. High Valyrian steel is still spoken by the educated classes throughout Essos, though it has evolved into various dialects in different regions.
The architectural styles pioneered by Valyrian builders still influence construction in the free cities, and the practice of slavery, adopted from Gis but embraced by Valyria, continues in Slaver's Bay, despite being the source of constant conflict. The return of magic to the world, marked by the hatching of Daenerys Targaryen's eggs, suggests that somehow the connection between dragons and magical power that characterized Valyria remains relevant. When her dragons were born, the glass candles in the citadel lit for the first time in centuries. Warlocks in Qarth suddenly found their powers increased, and red priests began speaking with confidence about prophecies and visions that had been unclear or absent. The world felt the presence of dragons again and responded as if waking from a long sleep. The lesson of Valyria, if there is one, seems to be about hubris and the price of ambition unchecked by wisdom. The Valyrians reached heights of power and accomplishment unmatched before or since, taming dragons, working magic as science, building cities that defied natural law, and ruling half the known world. But they achieved this through methods that required constant expansion, constant exploitation, and constant pushing of boundaries, both geological and moral. They lived atop volcanoes while destabilizing them through mining, practiced magic that required blood sacrifice, and built a society where magnificence coexisted with monstrous cruelty. And ultimately, whether through divine judgment, natural catastrophe, magical failure, or their own recklessness, they were destroyed so completely that their very name became synonymous with hubris and fall. The Valyrian steel blades that survive in the present day serve as physical reminders of what was lost, treasured not just for their practical qualities, but for what they represent, a connection to an age when humanity seemed capable of achieving anything it desired.
The fact that no one can create new Valyrian steel emphasizes the irreversibility of the loss, that some knowledge, once lost, cannot be recovered through effort or study. The survivors of Valyrian blood who scattered throughout the world after the Doom carried with them fragments of what had been, with the Targaryens obviously being the most prominent, but also lesser families and individuals who could trace ancestry back to dragon lords or Valyrian colonists. In Lys, the Lyseni are descended partly from Valyrian settlers and still display some of the characteristic features, and in Volantis, the old blood families who live within the Black Walls maintain Valyrian ancestry and traditions. These scattered remnants keep alive certain cultural practices, certain words and customs, certain memories of the civilization that birthed them. But ultimately, these are just echoes, fragments of something that can never be fully restored. The Valyrian Freehold was not merely a political entity, but an entire civilization, a way of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. And when it fell, something genuinely irreplaceable was lost. Subsequent civilizations have built on Valyrian foundations, used Valyrian technologies, spoken Valyrian languages, but none have been Valyria. None could be. The ruins stand as a warning as much as a loss, a reminder to every ambitious ruler who dreams of conquering the world, every sorcerer who seeks to push magical boundaries, every civilization that believes itself invincible and eternal, that the greatest power the world had known was destroyed in a single day of fire beyond imagining. All the dragons and all the magic and all the might meant nothing when catastrophe struck, and hubris is not punished by gods or fate, but by the natural consequences of reaching too far without understanding what one is reaching for. Yet there is also inspiration in the Valyrian story, despite its horrific ending, for they dared to attempt the impossible and often succeeded. They showed that human ambition, for all its dangers, can achieve wonders. The Valyrian steel that survived them is still the finest metal ever forged. The dragons they tamed became legends that inspired dreams for centuries, and the magical knowledge they accumulated, even though most of it was lost, suggested possibilities that continue to fascinate scholars and sorcerers. And so we reach the end of our journey through the complete history of old Valyria, from shepherds to conquerors to ruins beneath poisoned seas. We have witnessed the discovery of dragons in volcanic depths and the transformation of a people that discovery caused, walked through the magnificent capital with its topless towers and magical wonders built on foundations of blood and slavery, and observed the wars that established Valyrian dominance and the brutal annihilation of civilizations that dared resist. We have explored the dark heart of Valyrian magic, the blood sacrifices and flesh-twisting experiments that pushed beyond all moral boundaries, and descended into the mines where countless slaves died to fuel Valyrian glory. We have stood with Daenys the Dreamer as she warned her father of coming disaster, watched the Targaryens flee while others mocked them, and then witnessed the terrible validation of her visions as the doom consumed everything in a single day of fire beyond imagining. We have survived through the century of blood that followed, observing the chaos that erupts when a dominant power suddenly vanishes, and examined the legacy that persists 4 centuries later, the ruins that remain forbidden, the knowledge that was lost, the influences that continue to shape the world despite Valyria's absence. This history speaks to universal themes that transcend the specific details of dragons and magic, reminding us that even the mightiest civilizations are temporary, that power corrupts when wielded without wisdom, that ambition must be tempered by understanding of limits. The Valyrians achieved wonders we can barely comprehend and committed atrocities we can barely stomach, human in their brilliance and human in their flaws, magnified to an extraordinary scale by the power they commanded. The complete story of Valyria is not simple, cannot be reduced to heroes or villains, to triumph or tragedy alone. It was both and neither, a civilization that defies easy moral judgment, precisely because it achieved so much while causing so much suffering, because it pushed boundaries of knowledge and power in ways that were simultaneously admirable and horrifying. Understanding Valyria requires holding multiple truths in tension, recognizing that they were magnificent and monstrous, visionary and blind, powerful and fragile, eternal and suddenly gone. The story of Valyria is never truly over as long as we remember it and learn from it, and in that remembrance and learning lies the greatest tribute we can pay to this fallen civilization. The topless towers may have crumbled, the dragons may be gone, and a freehold may exist only in memory, but the lessons of Valyria endure, whispers of wisdom from the ashes of glory that continue to speak to us across the centuries.